The winter of 1864 bore down on Oak Ridge, Massachusetts with particular cruelty. Even for New England, the cold that year seemed to carry a malevolence beyond mere weather. Snow piled against the clapboard houses of the small mill town, and ice formed in thick sheets across the Blackwater River, silencing its usual rushing song. In a modest two-story home on Willow Street, Thomas Caldwell sat at his daughter's bedside, his weathered hands clasped in prayer. At 42, Thomas had already buried his wife Sarah 3 years prior, leaving him alone to raise their only child, 12-year-old Elizabeth. The girl lay pale against her pillows, her breath coming in shallow wisps that fogged briefly in the frigid air of the bedroom despite the roaring fire in the hearth. "Papa," Elizabeth whispered, her blue eyes suddenly clear after days of fever. "Mr. Holloway will die tomorrow at sunset." Thomas stiffened, his heart lurching at the odd pronouncement. "Lizzie, you mustn't say such things. The fever has confused you." "No, Papa." Elizabeth's voice was calm, certain. "I saw it. He's going to fall through the ice at the north bend of the river. They won't find his body until spring." Thomas brushed damp strands of blonde hair from his daughter's forehead. "Rest now, child. Dr. Morrison says your fever may break by morning if we keep you warm." But Elizabeth's gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the frost-covered window. "He's already walking toward the river, Papa. I can see him. He's carrying his fishing gear." Thomas swallowed hard. Josiah Holloway was indeed known for his winter ice fishing, a habit many considered foolhardy. "Lizzie, please. You need to sleep." The girl finally turned to look at her father, her expression unnervingly serene. "When it happens, you'll believe me, and then I'll tell you who's next." Thomas blew out the oil lamp and sat in darkness beside his daughter until her breathing deepened into sleep. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the elm trees lining the street. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 times, the sound muffled by the falling snow. The next day, Josiah Holloway did not return from his fishing expedition. His wife raised the alarm at dusk, and a search party found a hole in the ice at the north bend of the Blackwater, just as Elizabeth had described. Thomas Caldwell stood among the searchers, his face ashen as he stared at the jagged opening in the frozen river, the water black and still beneath the surface. "We'll drag the river when the thaw comes," Sheriff Miller announced grimly. "No use risking more lives tonight." As Thomas trudged home through the deepening snow, dread settled in his chest like a stone. Elizabeth was sitting up in bed when he returned, her fever broken, her eyes clear and knowing. "You believe me now, don't you, Papa?" she asked softly. Thomas couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he asked the question burning in his mind. "How did you know?" Elizabeth's small hand reached for his. "I see them, Papa. I see people walking toward their deaths. And now I can see Mrs. Fletcher. She'll be next. The consumption will take her Tuesday week." Rebecca Fletcher had been coughing since Christmas, a persistent hack that everyone in Oak Ridge had attributed to the unusually harsh winter. By the first Sunday in February, the seamstress was confined to her bed, her lungs rattling with each labored breath. Thomas Caldwell stood at the back of the crowded parlor during her funeral service, his eyes fixed on the simple pine coffin, his mind reeling with disbelief. "Tuesday week, just as Elizabeth had predicted. Your girl is improving, I take it?" Dr. Morrison murmured, appearing at Thomas's side. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice hollow. "The fever broke completely that night." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Good, good. Children are remarkably resilient. Though I must say she gave us quite a fright." Thomas hesitated, then asked, "Have you ever heard of fever dreams continuing after recovery? Delusions or fancies that persist?" Dr. Morrison's bushy eyebrows drew together. "Occasionally, the mind can play strange tricks during illness. Is Elizabeth experiencing something of the sort?" She ... double quotes, Thomas faltered. How could he explain what was happening without sounding as mad as he feared his daughter might be? "She has vivid dreams. Disturbing ones. Perfectly natural," the doctor assured him. "The brain must process the trauma of serious illness. Give her time, keep her routine normal, and I expect these dreams will fade." But Thomas knew better. Each night for the past 2 weeks, Elizabeth had whispered another name, another death, and each time her predictions had proven horribly accurate. First, it was old Mr. Holloway through the ice. Then Mrs. Fletcher claimed by consumption. After that came young William Pearson, crushed beneath a fallen tree while clearing his father's woodlow, at exactly when Elizabeth said it would happen, down to the hour. "Papa, why won't you write him down?" Elizabeth asked that evening as Thomas tucked her into bed. She had recovered fully from her illness, her cheeks once again rosy, her appetite restored. In all ways but one, she was the same sweet child she'd always been. "Write what down, Lizzie?" he asked, though he knew perfectly well what she meant. "The names, the dates, so we can warn them." Her blue eyes, so like her mother's, gazed up at him earnestly. "We could save them, Papa." Thomas sat heavily on the edge of the bed. Lizzie, we've discussed this. These are just dreams, coincidences, 3 coincidences, Papa. And tonight I saw Mr. Abernathy. His heart will stop on Thursday while he's tallying accounts at the mill. No one will find him until morning. Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine despite the warmth of the bedroom. Jeremiah Abernathy was the mill overseer, a robust man of 50 with no known ailments. "Elizabeth, you must stop this." People are beginning to talk, it was true. He had noticed the sideways glances, the hushed conversations that ceased when he entered the general store. Oakridge was a small town, and word spread quickly. "Let them talk," Elizabeth said with a shrug that seemed too old for her 12 years. "When Mr. Abernathy dies, they'll listen, and then we can save Mrs. Harper and her baby." Thomas blew out the candle without responding. As darkness filled the room, he couldn't help but wonder if Elizabeth's visions were real. From where or whom were they coming? The funeral bell tolled again on Friday morning. Jeremiah Abernathy found slumped over his ledgers at the cotton mill, just as Elizabeth had foretold. Heart failure, Dr. Morrison had declared, though the physician's face betrayed his puzzlement at the sudden death of a man with no history of cardiac problems. Thomas Caldwell stood in the swirling snow outside the church, unable to bring himself to enter. 4 deaths, 4 precise predictions. It could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or the fevered imaginings of a child. "Mr. Caldwell," Thomas turned to find Reverend Harlow regarding him with somber eyes. The minister was a thin, austere man who had served the Oakridge congregation for nearly 20 years. Reverend Thomas acknowledged with a slight nod. "I had hoped to speak with you," Harlow said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Perhaps you might call at the parsonage this afternoon? There is a matter of some delicacy I wish to discuss." Thomas knew immediately what the minister wanted to talk about. The rumors were spreading faster now. Whispers about Elizabeth and her uncanny predictions. Just yesterday, the butcher's wife had crossed the street to avoid passing near them. "I'll come after I close the smithy," Thomas agreed, dread pooling in his stomach. The Reverend studied him for a moment. "Your daughter's not attending the service?" "She's unwell," Thomas lied. In truth, he couldn't bear the thought of bringing Elizabeth. Couldn't stand to see the fear and suspicion in the eyes of people who had known her since birth. "I see." Reverend Harlow's tone suggested he didn't believe this explanation for a moment. "Until this afternoon, then." The parsonage was a drafty saltbox house adjacent to the church. Thomas knocked at precisely 4 o'clock, his knuckles white around the brim of his hat. "Come in, Mr. Caldwell." Reverend Harlow ushered him into a sparsely furnished study. A fire sputtered in the grate, providing more smoke than heat. "Please, sit." Thomas perched on the edge of an uncomfortable wooden chair while the minister settled behind his desk. "I'll come directly to the point," Harlow said. "There is talk in the town. Troubling talk. About my daughter," Thomas said flatly. "Indeed." The Reverend steepled his fingers. "It is said that Elizabeth has been predicting deaths. With alarming accuracy." Thomas stared at the worn floorboards. "People are superstitious, Reverend. They look for patterns where none exist. 4 deaths, Mr. Caldwell. 4 predictions, if the accounts I've heard are correct." Harlow leaned forward. "Such foreknowledge is not natural." "If there is truth to these rumors, what are you suggesting?" Thomas interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. The Reverend's expression hardened. In times past, Mr. Caldwell, a child with such abilities, might have faced serious accusations. Witchcraft has not been prosecuted in Massachusetts for nearly 2 centuries, but the fear remains. "This is madness," Thomas said, rising from his chair. "Elizabeth is a child, a girl who has been ill. Nothing more." "Then you deny these rumors?" "You can assure me that Elizabeth has made no such predictions." Thomas hesitated, and in that moment of silence he knew he had revealed too much. "I thought as much," Reverend Harlow sighed. "Mr. Caldwell, for your daughter's sake, for your own, you must bring her to me. Prayer may yet drive out whatever darkness has taken hold of her." "There is nothing wrong with my daughter," Thomas insisted, though doubt gnawed at him. "Good day, Reverend." As he stepped back into the swirling snow, Thomas could feel the weight of the minister's gaze on his back. He hurried home, his thoughts in turmoil. Elizabeth was waiting for him at the kitchen table, a piece of paper before her. "I've written it down, Papa," she said, pushing the paper toward him. "Mrs. Harper will hemorrhage after her baby is born on Monday. But if Dr. Morrison knows to expect it, he can save her." Thomas stared at his daughter's neat handwriting, a cold fear gripping his heart. "Lizzie, you must stop this. Please. I can't stop seeing them, Papa." Tears welled in her eyes. "But we can stop them from dying. We can help." By Sunday evening, half of Oakridge knew about Elizabeth Caldwell's list. Thomas had taken the paper to Dr. Morrison in desperate hope that the physician might prevent another tragedy. The doctor had listened with surprising gravity, promising to attend Margaret Harper's confinement personally. "You were right to come to me," Morrison had said, tucking the paper into his waistcoat pocket. "Though I cannot explain this ... phenomenon. I am not one to ignore a warning, however strange its source." But the doctor was less discreet than Thomas had hoped. By nightfall, the story had spread through town like wildfire. Some dismissed it as nonsense. Others crossed themselves when the Caldwells were mentioned. A few of the Boulder townspeople even gathered outside the smithy, demanding to know who else was on the death list. Thomas sent Elizabeth to bed early, trying to shield her from the growing tension. He sat alone in the kitchen, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, when a sharp knock came at the door. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his expression grim beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Evening, Thomas. May I come in?" Thomas stepped aside wordlessly. The sheriff stomped snow from his boots and moved to stand before the kitchen fire, warming his hands. "Strange business, this," Miller said finally. "Got half the town in a panic." "It's nothing, James. Just a child's fancies that got out of hand." The sheriff gave him a long look. "For dead, Thomas. Exactly as your girls said they would be. That's not nothing in my experience." Thomas sank into a chair. "What would you have me do?" "She's my daughter. Keep her close," Miller advised. "There's ugly talk brewing. Reverend Harlow's sermon this morning didn't help matters, all fire and brimstone about false prophets and those who traffic with dark forces." Thomas's head snapped up. "Elizabeth is not, I know that," the sheriff interrupted. "Known your girl since she was born. But fear makes people foolish, Thomas. And there's plenty of fear in Oak Ridge tonight." After Miller left, Thomas checked on Elizabeth. She was sleeping peacefully, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, one hand curled beneath her cheek. Looking at her, it seemed impossible that this child could be at the center of such darkness. Yet as he watched, her brow furrowed and she began to murmur in her sleep. Thomas leaned closer. "The bridge," she whispered. "The bridge will collapse when the mill workers cross. So many, Papa, so many will die." Thomas stumbled back from the bedside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Blackwater Bridge was the main crossing from the workers' housing to the cotton mill. Dozens crossed it 4 times daily at the changing of the shifts. If Elizabeth was right, if the bridge were to fail, the death toll would be catastrophic. But if he warned the town, who would believe him now? And if they did believe, what would they do to his daughter, the harbinger of so much death? Thomas sank to his knees beside Elizabeth's bed, took her small hand in his, and for the first time since his wife's death, he prayed with all his heart for guidance. Dawn broke gray and forbidding over Oak Ridge. Thomas had not slept, his mind racing between terrible alternatives. To speak or remain silent. To risk his daughter or risk the lives of his neighbors. In the cold light of morning, he knew there was only one choice he could live with. "Lizzie," he said gently, rousing his daughter, "we need to talk about your dream." Elizabeth sat up, instantly alert. "You believe me now? About the bridge?" "I'm trying to," Thomas admitted. "When did you see it happening?" "Tomorrow, when the morning whistle blows and the night shift comes home." Her voice was steady, her gaze direct. "The center supports will give way first. The wood is rotting beneath the waterline." Thomas felt a chill at the precision of her description. "How do you see these things, Lizzie? Please, help me understand." Elizabeth's expression softened. "I don't know, Papa. After the fever, when I was so sick, I started seeing people walking down paths that ended in darkness. I just know where the darkness waits for them." She reached for his hand. "I don't want to see these things." "But if I do, shouldn't we try to help?" Thomas pulled his daughter into a fierce embrace. "Yes," he whispered into her hair. "Yes, we should." An hour later, Thomas stood before Sheriff Miller's desk, Elizabeth at his side. He had recounted her latest vision, watching the lawman's face shift from skepticism to grave concern. "You're certain about this?" Miller asked Elizabeth directly. She nodded. 23 people will die if the bridge falls." The sheriff exhaled slowly. "That's mighty specific, Miss Caldwell." "I counted them," she said simply. Miller drummed his fingers on the desk. "Even if I believe this, and I'm not saying I do, what would you have me do? Close the bridge on the word of a child? The mill owners would have my badge." "Inspect it," Thomas urged. "Send someone to check the supports, as a routine precaution. If Elizabeth is wrong, no harm done. If she's right, ... The sheriff considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll have Simmons take a look." He worked as a carpenter before joining the department. He fixed Elizabeth with a stern gaze. "But this stays between us, understand? Town's already on edge." By midday, Deputy Simmons had returned, his expression troubled. "Sheriff, Mr. Caldwell, you'd better come see this." The 3 men stood beneath the Blackwater Bridge, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Simmons pointed to one of the central timber supports where the wood disappeared into the icy water. "Rot's bad. Real bad. And look here," he indicated a long crack running up the beam. "Weight of a dozen men crossing at once. This could give way sure enough." Miller stared at the damaged support, then at Thomas. "I don't know how she knew, but your girl was right. So this bridge isn't safe." Relief washed over Thomas, followed immediately by a new fear. If Elizabeth's prediction about the bridge was correct, what did that mean for her other visions? For Mrs. Harper, due to give birth the next day? "We need to close the bridge," he said urgently. "Now, before the shift change." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Simmons, fetch the barricades. I'll inform the mill owners." He turned to Thomas. "You should take Elizabeth home. And Thomas... people will ask questions about how we knew to check the bridge." "Let them ask," Thomas replied, thinking of the 23 lives that would be saved. "I don't care anymore." But as he and Elizabeth walked home through the snow-covered streets, Thomas could feel the weight of stares from windows and doorways. Word was spreading. By nightfall, everyone in Oak Ridge would know that Elizabeth Caldwell had saved the mill workers and that her terrible gift was real. The mill owners were furious. The sudden closure of the Blackwater Bridge meant production had to halt until the workers could be ferried across the river by boat, a slow and costly process. Rumors flew through Oak Ridge like wind-blown snow. The Caldwell girl was a witch. She had second sight. She was possessed by spirits. Some, however, viewed Elizabeth's warning as a miracle. By Monday afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside the smithy, not in anger but in supplication. They wanted to know if their names or the names of their loved ones were on what they called the death list. Thomas turned them away as gently as he could, but their desperation haunted him. Each face pleaded, "Tell me I'm safe. Tell me I will live to see spring." Inside the house, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, her slate before her, working diligently on her arithmetic as if nothing unusual were happening. Thomas marveled at her composure. "Lizzie," he said, sitting across from her, "I need to ask you something important." She set down her chalk and looked at him expectantly. "These visions you have, can you call them forth? Can you look for specific people?" Elizabeth considered the question. "I don't think so, Papa. I only see what's shown to me. Like looking through windows that open and close on their own. And how many windows are open right now?" "Just Mrs. Harper's," Elizabeth replied. "But Dr. Morrison knows what to do. He'll save her." As if summoned by her words, a sharp knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to find Dr. Morrison on the threshold, his medical bag in hand, his expression one of barely contained excitement. "It worked," he announced without preamble. "Margaret Harper delivered a healthy boy an hour ago. She began hemorrhaging afterward, just as Elizabeth predicted. But I was prepared. I had everything ready. Mother and child will both recover fully." He looked past Thomas to where Elizabeth sat. "It's extraordinary. Come in, doctor," Thomas said, closing the door against the curious stares from the street. "You should sit down." Once seated at the kitchen table, Morrison leaned toward Elizabeth. "My dear, you have a remarkable gift. A gift that could save countless lives." Elizabeth shook her head. "It doesn't work that way. I only see deaths that are coming soon, and only some of them. But those you do see, we can prevent them," the doctor insisted. "The bridge, Mrs. Harper." "We can use your visions for good." Thomas watched his daughter's face. She looked so tired suddenly, so much older than her 12 years. "Perhaps," she said softly. "But people are afraid of me now, aren't they?" Morrison couldn't meet her eyes. "People fear what they don't understand, Elizabeth. In time, they called Mama a witch too." Before she died, Elizabeth interrupted. "Because she knew which herbs would heal and which would harm. They didn't burn her, but they wanted to." Thomas felt as if he'd been struck. Elizabeth had never spoken of this before, and he had believed, hoped, that she had been too young to understand the whispers that had followed Sarah Caldwell in her final years. "That was different," he protested weakly. "Was it?" Elizabeth's blue eyes were piercing. "They're gathering outside our house right now, Papa. Some want help, but others... double quotes," she trailed off, looking toward the window where shadows moved against the drawn curtains. "Doctor." Morrison cleared his throat. "Thomas, I believe it might be best if Elizabeth came to stay at my home for a while. My wife and I have no children, as you know, and we have plenty of room. It would give people time to adjust to this... situation. You want to take my daughter from me?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "To protect her," Morrison insisted, "and to study this phenomenon. Think of the lives we could save if we understood how her visions work." Before Thomas could respond, Elizabeth spoke. "I'll go, Papa." "Lizzie, no. Just for a little while," she said, her small hand covering his larger one. "Until people stop being afraid. And Dr. Morrison can help me understand why this is happening to me." Thomas looked from his daughter to the doctor and back again. He wanted to refuse, to gather Elizabeth in his arms and flee Oakridge altogether. But where would they go? How far would they need to travel before the whispers of witch and Deathseer no longer followed them? 1 week, he said finally. She stays with you for 1 week, and I will visit every day. Morrison nodded eagerly. Of course. Of course. And I promise you, Thomas, I'll keep her safe. As Elizabeth went upstairs to pack a small bag, Thomas pulled the doctor aside. If anything happens to her, anything at all, there isn't a force on this earth that will protect you from me. Do you understand? The physician paled slightly but held his ground. I mean only to help her, Thomas. And to help others through her gift. Her gift, Thomas repeated bitterly. Is that what we're calling it now? The Morrison home stood on a hill overlooking Oakridge, a stately federal-style house that reflected the doctor's prominent position in the community. Thomas had visited many times over the years, but had never felt as unwelcome as he did now, standing rigidly in the parlor while Mrs. Morrison fussed over Elizabeth. Such a lovely child, Harriet Morrison cooed, stroking Elizabeth's blonde hair. We'll take excellent care of her, Mr. Caldwell. I've prepared the blue bedroom with a view of the garden. Thomas forced a smile. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Morrison. Lizzie, be sure to mind your manners. Elizabeth nodded solemnly. She hadn't cried when they left their home, even as neighbors had gathered to watch their departure, whispering behind raised hands. Thomas marveled at her composure while his own heart was breaking. I'll come tomorrow after I close the smithy, he promised, kneeling to embrace her. I know, Papa, she whispered in his ear. Don't worry about me. Be careful of the ice on Maple Street. It's deeper than it looks. Thomas pulled back to study her face. Is that one of your visions? Elizabeth smiled. No, Papa. Just something I noticed on our way here. For the first time in weeks, Thomas laughed, the sound startling in its normalcy. I'll be careful, Lizzie girl. As he walked back down the hill toward town, Thomas felt both lighter and heavier. Elizabeth would be safe with the Morrisons, safer perhaps than at home where fear and suspicion grew with each passing day. Yet the separation, however temporary, felt like another small death. The smithy was cold when he returned, the forge unlit. Thomas had neglected his work these past weeks, and several customers had taken their business to the blacksmith in Riverdale, 5 miles south. He couldn't blame them. Who wanted horseshoes forged by the father of a witch? He was stoking the forge when Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots. Thomas heard Elizabeth staying with the doc. News travels fast, Thomas remarked without looking up. Small town. Miller stepped inside, closing the door against the bitter wind. Thought you should know there was talk at the tavern last night. Some of the mill workers aren't happy about the bridge closure. Lost wages while repairs are made. They'd prefer to be dead? Thomas asked sharply. Miller held up his hands. I'm just telling you what I heard. And it wasn't just the bridge. Folks are connecting dots, Thomas. The 4 deaths your girl predicted, then the bridge, Mrs. Harper. They're scared. Of a 12-year-old girl. Thomas slammed the poker down. Of what she represents, Miller corrected. Change is hard for people. The unknown is harder. After the sheriff left, Thomas tried to lose himself in work, the familiar rhythm of hammer on metal usually soothing to his troubled mind. But today, each strike only reminded him of how quickly life could be reshaped, bent into unrecognizable forms by forces beyond control. By late afternoon, exhaustion and worry had driven him from the forge. He secured the smithy and began the walk up the hill to the Morrison house, eager to see Elizabeth, despite having visited only that morning. As he approached the doctor's home, Thomas noticed an unusual number of carriages parked outside. His pace quickened, concern blooming in his chest. The front door was opened by a hurried-looking maid who barely glanced at him before hurrying back toward the kitchen. Thomas stood in the entrance hall, hearing voices from the parlor, many voices, male and female, speaking in the hushed, urgent tones of people discussing something forbidden. He pushed open the parlor door without knocking. Inside, at least a dozen of Oakridge's most prominent citizens were gathered: Judge Pembroke and his wife, Reverend Harlow, the mill owner, Edward Blackwood, and several others. They fell silent at his entrance, all eyes turning toward him. In the center of the room, Elizabeth sat in a high-backed chair, looking small and pale but composed. Dr. Morrison stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas demanded, striding into the room. Morrison stepped forward. "Thomas, please understand. After news of the bridge spread, certain parties expressed ... interest in Elizabeth's abilities. I merely arranged a small demonstration." "A demonstration?" Thomas repeated incredulously. "My daughter's not some sideshow attraction," Papa, Elizabeth said quietly. "It's all right. I wanted to help." Thomas looked at his daughter, really looked at her. There were shadows beneath her eyes, and her face was drawn with fatigue. What have they asked of you, Lizzie? He asked softly. Only to look, she replied. To see if there's danger coming for any of them. Judge Pembroke cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, I assure you, we've treated your daughter with the utmost respect. Her gift. She is a child, Thomas interrupted, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. A child who has been ill, who has lost her mother, who deserves peace and privacy. Not to be paraded before the curious and the fearful. Thomas Morrison began placatingly. No one is exploiting Elizabeth. We're simply trying to understand. Understand? Thomas laughed bitterly. You understand nothing. None of you do. He turned to Elizabeth. Get your things, Lizzie. We're going home. For a moment no one moved. Then Reverend Harlow stepped forward, his thin face set in stern lines. Mr. Caldwell, I must caution you against interfering. Your daughter's abilities may be a gift from God, meant to save lives, or they may be something else. Either way, they must be studied, understood, and properly directed. By you? Thomas challenged. A man who spoke of witchcraft not 3 days ago? The Reverend's face reddened. I spoke of caution, of the dangers of unknown powers. You spoke of fear, Thomas corrected. And now you pretend concern? Lizzie, come. Now. Elizabeth slid from the chair and moved to her father's side. No one tried to stop her, though Thomas could see the frustration in Morrison's eyes, the calculation in Blackwood's. This isn't over, Thomas, the mill owner said quietly. What your daughter can do, it's valuable. Too valuable to waste. Thomas placed a protective arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. She is not a resource to be mined, Blackwood. She is my daughter. And if any of you come near her again without my permission, you'll answer to me. With that, he guided Elizabeth from the room, feeling the weight of their stares on his back as they departed. Snow was falling heavily as Thomas and Elizabeth made their way back down the hill toward town. The early February darkness had already descended, and Thomas found himself wishing he had brought a lantern. Elizabeth walked silently beside him, her small gloved hand clutching his. I'm sorry, Papa, she said finally. You have nothing to apologize for, Lizzie. Nothing at all. But I do, she insisted. I thought if I helped important people like Judge Pembroke and Mr. Blackwood, they wouldn't be afraid of me anymore. That they'd protect us. Thomas stopped and knelt before his daughter, snow collecting on his shoulders and hat. Listen to me, Elizabeth. You don't need their protection. You have me, always. She nodded, but her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. They're not going to leave us alone, are they? Thomas couldn't bring himself to lie. No, I don't think they will. They continued toward home in silence, the snow muffling their footsteps. As they passed the church, Thomas noticed a light burning in the parsonage study. Reverend Harlow had clearly hurried back from the Morrison house. What was he writing at his desk? Letters to colleagues in Boston? To church authorities? Thomas felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Papa, Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice tight with fear. Someone's in our house. Thomas followed her gaze through the swirling snow. He could make out a flicker of light behind the curtains of their front room. A light he had certainly not left burning. Stay behind me, he instructed, approaching the house cautiously. The front door was unlocked. Thomas pushed it open slowly, acutely aware of Elizabeth's presence at his back. Inside, the parlor lamp had been lit, and the fire in the hearth stoked a blazing life. A figure rose from Thomas's armchair as they entered. Sheriff Thomas acknowledged, tension draining from his shoulders. You startled us. James Miller removed his hat. Apologies, Thomas. I'd best to wait inside, given the weather. His eyes moved to Elizabeth. Evening, Miss Caldwell. I expected you to be at the doctor's house a while longer. Plans changed, Thomas said shortly. What brings you here at this hour? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Had a visitor this afternoon. Man from Boston, says he's with some society for psychical research. Heard about Elizabeth somehow. Thomas felt his heart sink. Already? The bridge incident was only yesterday. Word travels fast when it's strange enough, Miller replied. He's staying at the inn, plans to call on you tomorrow. It seemed very eager to meet Elizabeth. Did he indeed? Thomas helped Elizabeth remove her snow-covered coat and bonnet. Lizzie, go upstairs and warm yourself. I need to speak with the sheriff. Once Elizabeth had gone, Thomas turned to Miller. First the town elites, now strangers from Boston. It won't stop, will it? Miller sighed heavily. Afraid not. Girl like Elizabeth, what she can do, that's not something people will leave alone. He hesitated. There's more, Thomas. Reverend Harlow's been talking. Claims your Sarah was involved in unconventional practices, that Elizabeth's abilities might be inherited. Sarah was a healer, Thomas said through clenched teeth. She knew herbs, remedies passed down through her family, nothing more. I know that, Miller assured him, but others are willing to believe worse. And with Elizabeth's predictions coming true one after another, double quotes, he trailed off. Thomas sank into a chair. What would you do, James, if she were your daughter? The sheriff was silent for a long moment. I'd leave, he said finally. Take her somewhere new, somewhere no one knows about her gift. Give her a chance at a normal life. After Miller left, Thomas sat alone by the fire, turning the sheriff's advice over in his mind. Leave Oak Ridge, the only home Elizabeth had ever known. Leave the smithy his father had built, the house where Sarah had lived and died. It seemed unthinkable. Yet as he listened to the wind howling outside, Thomas knew Miller was right. There would be no peace for Elizabeth here, only fear, suspicion, and the endless demands of those who would use her gift for their own purposes. He climbed the stairs heavily, finding Elizabeth not in her bedroom but in Sarah's sewing room, a small space at the back of the house that Thomas had left untouched since his wife's death. Elizabeth was sitting on the floor beside an old cedar chest, her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Lizzie, what are you doing in here? She looked up, her expression solemn. Remembering Mama. She used to bring me here when I was little. She'd tell me stories while she sewed. Thomas knelt beside her, his throat tight with emotion. Your mother loved you very much. She had dreams too, didn't she? That's what people whispered about. Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes. Sometimes Sarah knew things before they happened. Small things, usually which neighbors would fall ill when the first frost would come. She kept it to herself, mostly. But people found out anyway, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. People always notice what's different, Thomas acknowledged. Your mother learned to be careful, to help quietly. He paused, gathering his courage. Lizzie, how would you feel about leaving Oak Ridge? Elizabeth didn't seem surprised by the question. Because of what I can do. Because I want you to have a chance at a normal life. Somewhere people don't know about your visions. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. Would we go far away? As far as we need to. Perhaps California. I hear the winters are mild there. A small smile flickered across her face. That sounds nice. Then her expression grew serious again. But the visions would come with us, Papa. They don't care where we live. Thomas took her hands in his. Then we'll face them together, wherever we are. But somewhere new we can decide who knows and who doesn't. We can be more careful. Elizabeth nodded slowly. When would we go? Soon, Thomas said, decision crystallizing in his mind. Very soon. The stranger from Boston arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. He introduced himself as Professor Everett Hammond of the New England Society for Psychical Research, a thin, bespectacled man with an eager manner that immediately put Thomas on edge. Fascinating case, truly fascinating, Hammond declared, pacing the Caldwell parlor. A child seer with proven predictive abilities. I've documented similar phenomena, but rarely with such consistency and specificity. My daughter's not a case, Professor, Thomas said coldly, and she won't be documented or studied. Hammond blinked in surprise. But Mr. Caldwell, surely you understand the scientific importance of such gifts, the potential contributions to our understanding of the human mind, of temporal perception. What I understand, Thomas replied, is that my daughter deserves privacy and peace, not scrutiny and exploitation. The professor's manner shifted, becoming more conciliatory. Perhaps I've been too forward. Allow me to explain more fully what our society does. We approach these phenomena with scientific rigor, yes, but also with deep respect for the individuals involved. We could offer Elizabeth's protection, education tailored to her unique abilities. No, Thomas interrupted firmly. Thank you for your interest, Professor, but we must decline. Hammond's expression hardened slightly. I urge you to reconsider, Mr. Caldwell. Word of your daughter's abilities is spreading. Others will come, those less scrupulous, less concerned with Elizabeth's welfare. Our society can shield her from such attention. As you've shielded her so far? Thomas asked sarcastically. News of the bridge incident reached Boston remarkably quickly. The professor had the grace to look embarrassed. We have connections in many communities. When reports of multiple verified predictions reached us, you should leave now, Thomas said, rising from his chair. Hammond reached into his coat and withdrew a card. My contact information, should you change your mind. We'll be in the area for several days. He placed the card on the table. Mr. Caldwell, please understand, your daughter's gift is extraordinary. It should be nurtured, studied for her benefit and for the advancement of knowledge. After showing the professor out, Thomas found Elizabeth in the kitchen, ostensibly working on her lessons, but clearly having listened to every word. We're leaving tonight, aren't we? She asked without looking up. Thomas nodded. Pack only what you need. We'll travel light. As dusk fell, Thomas hitched their old mare to the sleigh. He had spent the day making discreet preparations, withdrawing his modest savings from the Oak Ridge Bank, selecting essential tools from the smithy, packing food and warm clothing. They would travel to Springfield first, then take the train west. How far west, Thomas hadn't decided. Far enough that the name Caldwell would mean nothing to anyone. Elizabeth appeared at his side as he secured the last of their bags. "I'm ready, Papa." She wore her warmest coat and carried a small carpet bag containing, Thomas knew, her mother's Bible, a favorite doll, and a handful of treasured books. Everything else she was leaving behind. "Are you certain about this, Lizzie?" he asked softly. "It won't be easy, starting over." She looked back at the only home she had ever known, her expression thoughtful. "I'm sure. But Papa, before we go, there's something I need to tell you." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. "Another vision?" Elizabeth nodded, her face grave in the gathering darkness. "It came last night. The strongest one yet." She hesitated. "It's about Oak Ridge, Papa. The whole town." Thomas knelt before her. "Tell me." "Fire," she whispered. "I saw fire consuming everything. The mill, the church, all the houses. It starts at the mill, when the night watchman falls asleep with his pipe still lit. The wind carries the sparks to the wool storehouse, and then double quotes," she trailed off, her eyes distant. "So many people, Papa. So many won't escape." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "When, Lizzie? When does this happen?" "Tomorrow night. Just after midnight." Thomas stood, his mind racing. If Elizabeth was right and he had no reason to doubt her now, the entire town of Oak Ridge was in danger. Hundreds of lives, the homes and livelihoods of people he had known his entire life. People who now feared and mistrusted his daughter. We have to warn them," Elizabeth said, reading his thoughts. "Even if they don't believe us. Even if they're afraid of me." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Their escape, so carefully planned, would have to wait. "Yes," he agreed heavily. "We have to try." He helped Elizabeth into the sleigh and took up the reins. Instead of heading south toward Springfield, he turned the mare toward town, toward the sheriff's office where James Miller would still be working at this hour. As they drove through the snowy streets, Thomas noticed curtains twitching, faces peering out at them. News of the Boston professor's visit had spread, it seemed. More rumors, more fear. Would anyone believe their warning now? The sheriff's office was dark when they arrived. Thomas helped Elizabeth down from the sleigh and pounded on the door, but received no answer. "He must be at the tavern," Thomas muttered, "or making his rounds." "What do we do now, Papa?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small in the vast, silent night. Thomas stared down the main street of Oak Ridge at the familiar buildings dusted with snow, at the distant silhouette of the cotton mill where, in just over 24 hours, disaster would begin. "We go to Reverend Harlow," he decided grimly. "Whatever he thinks of us, he'll listen. He has to." The parsonage was warm and well lit, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Reverend Harlow received them with obvious surprise and poorly concealed suspicion, but he invited them in, more out of Christian duty than genuine hospitality. "Mr. Caldwell, Miss Elizabeth, an unexpected visit at this hour." "We need your help, Reverend," Thomas said without preamble. "Elizabeth has had another vision. The entire town is in danger." Harlow's thin face tightened. "Indeed? And what calamity awaits us now?" "Fire," Elizabeth said, stepping forward. "Tomorrow night. It starts at the mill and spreads to the whole town. Many people will die if they're not warned." The minister studied her for a long moment. "Convenient, is it not, that your visions now encompass mass destruction? Just as interest in your ... abilities has begun to spread beyond our little community?" Thomas felt anger flare in his chest. "You think we're lying, that we'd invent something like this?" "I think," Harlow said carefully, "that certain parties have shown great interest in your daughter's supposed gift. Professor Hammond, for instance, represents a society known for its generous patronage of those with unusual talents." "We turned Hammond away," Thomas snapped. "We want nothing to do with his society or his patronage." "So you say," Harlow folded his hands before him. "Yet here you are, with a prediction so dire, so public, that it would certainly cement your daughter's reputation if it came to pass." Elizabeth moved closer to her father, her face pale but composed. "You don't have to believe me, Reverend. But please help us warn people. It's just in case." For a moment, something like doubt flickered in Harlow's stern eyes. Then his expression hardened again. "I will not be party to spreading panic based on a child's nightmares or worse. A calculated bid for attention and profit." "Profit?" Thomas echoed incredulously. "We're leaving Oak Ridge, Reverend. Tonight, after we've done what we can to warn people. Elizabeth deserves a chance at a normal life, away from fear and suspicion." This revelation seemed to surprise Harlow. Leaving? But Professor Hammond will have to find another case to study, Thomas finished. Now, will you help us or not? The Reverend hesitated, clearly reassessing the situation. I cannot endorse this warning officially, he said finally, but I will speak to Sheriff Miller. Suggest he increase patrols near the mill tomorrow night, as a precaution. It was less than Thomas had hoped for, but more than he had expected. Thank you, Reverend. As they turned to leave, Harlow cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, if you are truly leaving Oak Ridge, I hope you find peace elsewhere. Your daughter is remarkable, whatever the source of her abilities. Thomas nodded curtly and ushered Elizabeth outside. Back in the sleigh, he turned to his daughter. Where now, Lizzie? Who else might listen? Elizabeth considered the question. It's Dr. Morrison. He believes in what I can do, and people respect him. The doctor was still awake when they arrived at his house, reading by lamplight in his study. He greeted them with surprise but no hesitation, immediately calling for his wife to bring tea and blankets for Elizabeth. Thomas, I must apologize for yesterday, Morrison began. The gathering grew larger than I intended. I should have consulted you before inviting others to meet Elizabeth. That's not why we're here, Thomas said, explaining Elizabeth's vision of the fire and their unsuccessful attempt to enlist Reverend Harlow's full support. Morrison listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. A mill fire in winter could indeed be catastrophic, he acknowledged. The river is frozen, limiting our water supply for fighting the flames. And with the bridge closed, the workers' housing on the north bank is effectively cut off from the town proper. Will you help us warn people? Elizabeth asked. The doctor looked at her with genuine compassion. Yes, my dear, I will. My position affords me certain credibility that your father may lack at present. He turned to Thomas, though I'm saddened to hear you plan to leave Oak Ridge. Elizabeth's gift is hers to use as she chooses, Thomas interrupted. Not yours, not Hammond's, not anyone's. Morrison nodded slowly. I understand. Then let us focus on preventing this tragedy, as a parting service to the town. He reached for paper and pen. I'll write to Edward Blackwood immediately, urging him to double the night watch at the mill and check all pipes and heating sources. As for the town itself, ball quotes, he hesitated. A general evacuation would be difficult to justify without causing panic. We don't need a general evacuation, Elizabeth said. Just precautions. Extra water barrels distributed throughout town. People sleeping in their clothes, ready to flee if necessary. Children and the elderly moved to the eastern side of town, furthest from the mill. Thomas and Morrison both stared at her, struck by the practical wisdom in her suggestions. Out of the mouths of babes, the doctor murmured. Yes, those are sensible measures that could be implemented discreetly. He began writing again. I'll frame it as concern over the extreme cold and the limited firefighting capacity with the river frozen. Blackwood and the town council respect my medical opinion. As Morrison wrote his letters, Thomas pulled Elizabeth aside. Are you certain about the timing, Lizzie? Tomorrow at midnight? She nodded solemnly. Yes, Papa. I saw the mill clock when the first flames appeared. It was striking 12. Thomas embraced her tightly. Then we have 1 day to prevent it. And afterward, whatever happens, we'll leave this place. I promise you that. Morning found Thomas and Elizabeth still at the Morrison home, where the doctor had insisted they stay the night. Thomas had slept little, his mind churning with plans and contingencies. By dawn, he had made a decision. I'm going to the mill, he announced as they sat at breakfast. I need to see the layout for myself, identify the danger points. Morrison looked concerned. Thomas, Blackwood may not welcome your presence there given recent events. I don't care, Thomas replied. I was a volunteer with the fire brigade before Sarah died. I know what to look for. Elizabeth set down her spoon. I'm coming with you, Papa. Absolutely not, Thomas began, but his daughter's steady gaze stopped him. I saw where it starts, she said simply. The exact spot. The night watchman's chair in the south corner of the main floor, near the carding machines. Morrison cleared his throat. She has a point, Thomas. Elizabeth's knowledge could be invaluable. And so, an hour later, Thomas and Elizabeth stood before the imposing brick facade of the Blackwater Cotton Mill, the largest building in Oak Ridge and the source of the town's prosperity. Snow swirled around them as they approached the main entrance. The day watchman recognized Thomas and waved them through with minimal questions, the advantages of living one's entire life in a small town. Inside, the mill was a cathedral of industry, massive looms and spinning frames stretching in orderly rows across the vast floor. Workers moved efficiently among the machines, their faces grim in the weak winter light filtering through the high windows. Elizabeth tugged at her father's sleeve, pointing toward the southern corner. There, she whispered. That's where it begins. Thomas followed her gaze to a small alcove where a worn wooden chair sat beside a pot-bellied stove. He could imagine the night watchman as silly enough, seeking warmth during his long, cold shift, perhaps lighting his pipe for comfort in the dark hours. "We need to speak with the foreman," Thomas said, scanning the floor for the familiar figure of Harold Pierce. They found Pierce in his small office, reviewing production figures. He greeted Thomas with surprise and Elizabeth with poorly disguised unease. "Caldwell. Didn't expect to see you here. Heard you were leaving town." "Not yet," Thomas replied. "Harold, I need your help. There's reason to believe the mill may be in danger. A fire hazard in the south corner by the carding machines." Pierce frowned. "Fire hazard? What are you talking about?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "The night watchman's station. It's too close to the cotton waste. One spark from a pipe and this whole place could go up." Understanding dawned in Pierce's eyes. "This is about one of your girls. Predictions ... Isn't it?" He glanced at Elizabeth with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Does it matter?" Thomas countered. "You know I've worked the fire brigade for years. You know how dry it is in here, how quickly flame would spread? Is it worth the risk to ignore the warning?" Pierce hesitated, clearly torn between skepticism and prudence. "What do you want me to do? Blackwood won't shut down production on the word of—" He broke off, glancing at Elizabeth again. "Not shut down," Thomas assured him. "Just move the watchman station away from the carding area. Clear the cotton waste more frequently. Add more water barrels on that side of the floor." "Simple precautions," Elizabeth added softly. "Please, Mr. Pierce." Perhaps it was the directness of her gaze or the genuine concern in her voice, but something seemed to reach the foreman. He sighed heavily. "I'll do what I can, Caldwell. No promises, but I'll try." As they left the mill, Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They'd done all they could. Morrison would reach Blackwood and the town council. Pierce would address the immediate danger in the mill itself. Now they had only to complete their preparations for departure. "Papa," Elizabeth said as they walked home through the snowy streets, "do you think it will be enough?" Thomas squeezed her hand. "I hope so, Lizzie. I truly hope so." That evening, as darkness fell over Oak Ridge for what would be their last night in the town, Thomas and Elizabeth sat before the fire in their parlor. Their bags were packed, their affairs in order. At dawn, they would leave for Springfield and the train west, regardless of what happened with the mill. "Are you afraid?" Thomas asked his daughter softly. Elizabeth considered the question. "Not of leaving," she said finally, "but of what I can do. Of what it means." "What do you think it means?" She was silent for a long moment, her young face solemn in the firelight. "I think that some people are given gifts they don't understand. Like Mama with her herbs and her dreams. Like me with my visions." She looked up at her father. "I think the gift isn't the problem. It's what people do with it or because of it." Thomas felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to his eyes. "You are very wise, Elizabeth Caldwell." She smiled, a flash of the carefree child she had been before the fever, before the visions. "Will you tell me stories about California, Papa, about the ocean and the mountains?" And so Thomas spoke of distant places he had only read about, painting pictures of golden hills and endless blue waters, of cities where no one knew their names or their history. As the clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, he wove a future of possibilities for his extraordinary daughter. Outside, snow continued to fall on Oak Ridge, covering the mill, the church, the houses of friends and strangers alike in a blanket of pristine white. Whether fire would come to claim the sleeping town, only the hours ahead would tell. What Thomas knew with certainty was this. By morning, he and Elizabeth would be gone, leaving behind the fear and suspicion, taking with them only each other and the gift mysterious, burdensome, miraculous, that had changed their lives forever. In the soft light of the parlor, Elizabeth finally drifted to sleep, her head resting against her father's shoulder. Thomas gazed down at her peaceful face and whispered a promise. "Whatever comes, Lizzie girl, we face it together. Always."